Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking Professor Stephen Smith's absolutely fascinating defense of politics. We live in a world that often feels incredibly polarized, right? Like we're constantly swinging like a pendulum between hyper-nationalism on one side and this borderless globalism on the other. It's a tension we literally all feel, yet we rarely step back to actually analyze it. So today, we're going to explore how we navigate these modern extremes to find a true civic balance, drawing directly from Professor Smith's lecture notes. Let's dive right in.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with defining true politics, look at the nationalist extreme, swing over to the cosmopolitan extreme, examine the American synthesis, and finish up with educating citizens.
All right, Section 1, Defining True Politics.
It's a word we use every single day, right? In the news, at the dinner table, at work. But what actually is politics? Is it just a ruthless power struggle, a tribal war between competing factions? Or is it something far more fundamental to how we actually manage to live together in a society?
Well, to answer that, Smith anchors his lecture in Bernard Crick's 1962 work, In Defense of Politics. Crick defines politics as a distinctive human activity where conflicts of interest are adjudicated by discussion, persuasion, and debate. Now, the absolutely crucial point here is that second half. It is not resolved by force or fraud. When a society resorts to violence, tyranny, or deception to settle its disputes, that isn't politics. Actually, it's the exact opposite. That is the complete breakdown of politics. A true political society operates under agreed-upon rules to handle our inevitable, very human differences, relying on words rather than weapons. And tied deeply to this idea of a political society is the concept of patriotism, or loyalty to your political community. Smith illustrates why this matters by totally rejecting that famous claim by writer E.M. Forster. You might know the one, where he said he would rather betray his country than betray his friend. Sounds noble, doesn't it? But Smith argues this is a completely false choice. He points to the infamous Cambridge spies of the 1930s, like Kim Philby, who betrayed England to the Soviet Union. By severing that foundational loyalty to their country, they ultimately ended up betraying their closest friends to Moscow anyway. The takeaway here? Loyalty and betrayal are interconnected patterns. Loyalty is a moral habit, a deep-seated civic virtue. It's not just a bus stop decision you can hop on and off whenever you feel like it.
Moving on to Section 2, the nationalist extreme. So Smith introduces us to the German legal philosopher Carl Schmitt. Now, Schmitt had a seriously dark view of human nature. He essentially saw man as a dangerous animal. He argued that politics is an inescapable antagonism. For Schmitt, everything, and I mean everything, boils down to the distinction between friend and enemy. He believed that war, or at least the constant preparation for it, is the permanent backdrop of our political existence. It's a pretty bleak, unyielding way to look at how societies operate. And because Schmitt saw humans as existing in this continual state of conflict, his version of politics demands total, unquestioning group solidarity. It's basically a super high-stakes, life-for-death version of the Red Sox versus the Yankees. You're either with us or you're against us. In this worldview, all humanitarian appeals, things like universal human rights or global free trade, are totally dismissed as illusions. They're just seen as deceptive tactics trying to cover up this fundamental, deeply tribal conflict.
But Smith completely dismantles Schmitt's worldview on three fronts. First off, there's a huge internal contradiction. I mean, if the friend-enemy logic is a universal human trait, why would it neatly stop at national borders? Logically, it wouldn't. It would inevitably lead to unending civil war within states, fracturing society into smaller and smaller factions. Second, it's entirely self-defeating. A politics of unremitting war destroys the very peace and sovereign state required for actual debate to function. And finally, it's totalizing. Schmitt takes the most extreme condition imaginable, sheer survival in war, and tries to make it the everyday norm for human life, which completely eliminates any space for normal, peaceful disagreement.
Okay, Section 3, the cosmopolitan extreme.
Now let's swing the pendulum all the way to the other side. Here, Smith turns to the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant approached things from the exact opposite angle of Schmitt. He argued that citizenship is just an arbitrary accident of birth. It's a random genetic lottery. And because we don't choose where we're born, Kant believed we owe no greater moral obligation to our fellow citizens than we do to any other human being on Earth. Our moral duties, in his view, completely transcend national borders. So Kant envisioned what he called a kingdom of ends. This is a cosmopolitan ethic, where everyone gets equal moral values simply by virtue of their shared humanity. His ultimate goal was perpetual peace, achieved not through national strength, but through a confederation of republics governed by international law. And this Kantian ideal has been massively influential. Rather than just staying a philosophical theory, you can see its direct imprint on global frameworks, shaping real-world initiatives like Woodrow Wilson's 14 Points and the UN Declaration of Human Rights.
But Smith critiques this anti-political extreme just as sharply. First up, there's a massive enforcement problem. Referencing Thomas Hobbes, Smith points out that covenants without the sword are really just words. Without a sovereign power, who is actually enforcing these international norms? Nobody. Furthermore, Smith notes that stripping away local traditions for universal rules leaves an unenforceable void. Disconnecting people from their particular local arrangements removes the source of reverence and meaning in their lives. Eventually, Smith argues this kind of logic inevitably leads toward a world state, something even Kant himself admitted would be a soulless despotism, totally disconnected from the lived reality of its citizens.
Which brings us to Section 4, the American synthesis. So, how do we resolve this tension? Well, Smith uses Aristotle's concept of the mean to map out a resolution. Aristotle taught that virtue is the midpoint between excess and deficiency. We can apply this directly to patriotism. The nationalist truth is that our particular traditions make us who we are, right? But the cosmopolitan's truth is that human dignity comes from our universal capacity for choice. True virtue, a balanced patriotism, requires us to synthesize both of these truths. We have to carefully avoid the pitfall of blind attachment on one side and total rootlessness on the other. To really highlight why we can't just abandon our particular traditions for a purely universal identity, Smith asks a pretty funny question. Who was the Shakespeare or Milton of Esperanto? Esperanto, of course, being that artificial universal language created to transcend borders. It's a great question, right? And it drives home a very serious point. True greatness, art, and profound meaning require deep roots in a specific, particular culture and language. We literally need our local context to flourish. And according to Smith, the American model provides this exact, delicate synthesis. America was founded on a universal proposition, the Declaration of Independence, declaring that all men are created equal, which was heavily influenced by John Locke's universal philosophy of rights. But that universal ideal is firmly embedded within a highly particular dimension: the U.S. Constitution, a specific history of American statesmen, and a localized, practiced way of life. To be a citizen in the fullest sense, Smith argues, requires an active immersion in both the philosophical universal tradition and the particular political history.
Finally, Section 5, educating future citizens.
But if balancing this is the key to politics, Smith believes we are facing a massive crisis in how we teach it. In a pretty sharp polemic during his final lecture, he argues that modern universities are actively failing to teach political responsibility. He points out that among intellectuals, patriotism has fallen on incredibly hard times. He suggests that in many elite university settings, expressing a genuine interest in patriotism is treated as admitting to something morally suspect or deeply shameful, rather than a basic civic necessity. Smith breaks down this educational failure into two distinct critiques on campus. On one hand, he critiques history departments for frequently focusing almost exclusively on national guilt and failures, like racism and moral evils, while completely omitting the necessary counterweight of historical excellence, tradition, and statesmanship. Then, on the other hand, he takes aim at his own field, political science. He argues that modern political science has reduced profound moral choices to value-neutral game theory. It treats students as rational actors, maximizing preferences, but never stops to ask what they should have a preference for. Smith calls this value neutrality a form of nihilism that completely abdicates the responsibility to cultivate civic virtue. His proposed solution to this educational void is refreshingly straightforward. First, universities absolutely must recognize their role in cultivating civic-minded arbiters of disputes. Second, we have to return to reading the foundational old books: Plato, Machiavelli, Montesquieu, the Federalist Papers. Why? Because these texts actually grapple with the very human complexities that modern game theory completely ignores. And third, we must study world historical statesmen. Only by immersing ourselves in these foundational texts and histories can we relearn the art of political judgment that we're so desperately lacking today. And this brings us to the true urgency of Smith's defense of politics. We need citizens capable of debate rather than force, who can balance universal human dignity with a genuine love for their particular traditions. But if our institutions are failing to teach this balance,
We are left with a haunting question from Karl Marx that challenges the very foundation of our modern society. If the teachers are no longer teaching political responsibility, who will educate the educators? It's some serious food for thought as we navigate our own political reality today. Thanks so much for learning with us on this explainer.